There is a number that almost no one is talking about: $112 billion. That is how much one country, a nation smaller than the state of New Jersey, has spent since October 2023. Not on infrastructure, not on education, not on a space program, on survival. And here is the part that should stop you cold. While spending that money, their economy grew. That is not a typo. That is not a trick. That is the Israel economic paradox. And it is one of the most remarkable financial stories of the 21st century. To understand how this is even possible, you have to go back, not to 2023, not to the 1990s. You have to go back to 1948, to the very first day this country existed, because the economic model Israel runs on today was built not in a boardroom, but in a war. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence. Within 24 hours, 5 Arab armies invaded. The country had no air force, almost no artillery, and a population of roughly 800,000 people. What it had was a problem that would define its entire economic future. It needed to survive, and survival was extraordinarily expensive. In those first years, military spending consumed over 20% of GDP. To put that in perspective, the United States, the most powerful military economy in the world, currently spends about 3.5%. Israel was spending 6 times that ratio, and they were a brand new country with almost nothing. So they did what any rational actor does in an impossible situation. They built a system. The 1950s and 1960s were defined by austerity. The government rationed food. Immigrants poured in from Europe and the Middle East. Holocaust survivors, refugees, families with nothing but the clothes they carried. The state had to house them, feed them, arm them, and build an economy at the same time. Foreign aid, primarily from the United States and from Jewish communities abroad, kept the country solvent. But aid is not a business model. Aid runs out. Aid comes with conditions. And Israel's leadership understood early that dependency was a vulnerability they could not afford. So they made a decision that would echo through every decade that followed. They would turn their greatest burden, military spending, into an economic engine. The 1967 Six-Day War changed everything. In 6 days, Israel defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. The world was stunned. But what happened next in the Israeli economy is almost never talked about. Defense spending exploded. By the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack that nearly broke the country, military expenditure reached a historic high of 31% of GDP. 31%. The entire national economy was oriented around the military. And out of that pressure, something extraordinary emerged. When you spend that much money on defense technology, you get very good at it. Companies like Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace Industries, and Rafael Advanced Defense Systems were not born as global exporters. They were born as survival tools. They built drones when drones were science fiction. They built missile defense systems when the technology barely existed. They built cybersecurity infrastructure because their enemies were sophisticated and the stakes were existential. Every breakthrough they made was tested in real conditions, against real threats, and that made their products something that militaries around the world were willing to pay for. By 2024, Israel's defense exports reached $14.79 billion, a new all-time record, a 13% increase over the previous year. European countries alone accounted for 54% of those exports. The 3 largest defense companies, Elbit, IAI, and Rafael, had combined order backlogs of $65 billion. These are not small numbers. These are the numbers of a defense industry that had been pressure tested for 75 years and emerged as one of the most sophisticated in the world. But defense was only half the story. Because at some point in the 1990s, Israel made a second bet. If the military had built their engineering talent and their technological culture, Why not apply that culture to the civilian economy? The government launched programs to attract venture capital. They invested in university research. They gave tax incentives to foreign technology companies to set up research and development centers in Israel. Intel came, Microsoft came, Google came, Cisco came. And then something remarkable happened. Israeli engineers started their own companies. Startups multiplied. The term startup nation was not invented by marketing executives. It was earned company by company, exit by exit. Here is how deep that ran. In venture capital raised per capita, Israel ranked second in the entire world, behind only the United States. Not second in the Middle East, second on Earth. A country of 9 million people, surrounded by hostile neighbors, with no oil, no navigable rivers, and almost no natural resources, attracted more venture capital per person than China, Germany, Japan, and the entire European Union combined. The mechanism behind this was a little-known government program called Yozma, launched in 1993. The Israeli government put up $100 million of public money to de-risk foreign investment. It was a one-time bet. It worked so well that within a decade, private venture capital replaced it entirely and never looked back. By 2023, Israel's high-tech sector accounted for nearly 20% of GDP and more than 50% of total exports. A country of 9 million people was producing technology that competed with Silicon Valley. The GDP per capita crossed $54,000, placing Israel alongside Germany, the UK, and France in terms of individual prosperity. And in unicorn companies per capita, startups valued at over $1 billion, Israel ranked first in the world, 11 unicorns per $100 billion of GDP. The United States ranked third. And then came October 7th, 2023. The economic shock was immediate and severe. Within weeks, Israel called up over 300,000 military reservists. These were not soldiers sitting in barracks. These were software engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, factory workers, accountants, the productive core of a modern economy, pulled out of the workforce overnight. Tourism collapsed. Foreign investment paused. Credit rating agencies put Israel on watch. The shekel dropped. The stock market fell. Monthly military spending, which had been running at $1.8 billion before the attack, nearly tripled to $4.7 billion by the end of 2023. The annual defense budget for 2024 reached $46.5 billion, an increase of 65% over the prior year. That figure represented 8.8% of GDP. For context, only Ukraine, a country actively fighting a full-scale land war against Russia, spent a higher percentage. Israel was not just a country at war. It was running the second most intensive military economy on Earth. Now here is a number that almost nobody reported. In October 2024, Moody's did something it had not done in Israel's entire modern history. It downgraded Israel's sovereign credit rating by 2 full notches, from a 2 all the way down to Baa1, in a single move. Not 1 notch. 2. That is the kind of cut reserved for countries in genuine fiscal crisis. The Israeli government called it a colossal mistake, but Moody's was not done. S&P downgraded Israel twice in 2024 as well, and kept the outlook negative going into 2025, warning explicitly that a direct confrontation with Iran could trigger further cuts. When 3 of the world's most powerful credit agencies move against you simultaneously, the borrowing costs go up. Every bond Israel issues now costs more to service. Every billion borrowed is more expensive than the billion before it. That is not a headline. That is a compounding tax on every future budget for the next 30 years. The budget deficit exploded. In 2024, Israel's fiscal deficit hit 6.9% of GDP. Germany's was around 2%. France ran about 5%. The United States, which everyone treats as the global standard for fiscal irresponsibility, was at 6.5%. Israel was borrowing money at a pace that alarmed its own central bank. The governor of the Bank of Israel publicly criticized the government's wartime budget, warning that without serious fiscal adjustment, The country's debt trajectory was unsustainable. And yet, here is where the story turns. In 2024, Israel's economy grew by just 1%. Barely a pulse, but by 2025, growth rebounded to 3.1%, while deficit financing a $112 billion bill, while running a defense budget larger than most countries' entire national budgets, while navigating a geopolitical environment that had shaken global energy markets and sent oil prices above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. How do you grow during that? How does any economy do that? The answer is something economists call the war economy multiplier, and it is deeply counterintuitive. When a government spends $46 billion on defense, that money does not disappear into a void. It flows into domestic defense companies that hire engineers. It flows into logistics firms moving equipment. It flows into manufacturers producing components. It flows into technology firms receiving contracts. Israel's defense industry employed tens of thousands of highly paid professionals, and when those companies received record contracts, they hired, they expanded, and they spent. The three largest defense firms, Elbit, IAI, and Raphael, reported record revenues in 2024 alongside those $65 billion order backlogs. Government spending, in the most literal sense, replaced the private investment that had paused. Meanwhile, the high-tech sector, which had been the crown jewel of the civilian economy, proved more resilient than almost anyone predicted. In the first 3 quarters of 2025, Israeli tech companies raised $11.9 billion in private venture funding, an 18% increase over the same period in 2024. The median deal size hit $10.5 million, the highest ever recorded. Cybersecurity firms, which had an obvious advantage in a world growing more dangerous by the month, led all sectors. Israel's startup ecosystem grew 20.6% in 2025, ranking third globally, behind only the United States and the United Kingdom. In the middle of the most expensive crisis in the country's history, the innovation engine kept running. The global market was essentially paying Israel to be good at what it had spent 75 years being forced to learn. But resilience has limits, and the structural questions Israel now faces are not questions of the next quarter. They are questions of the next generation. Here is one that almost never surfaces in mainstream coverage. In 2008, Israel's parliament passed a quiet amendment to the tax code, one that exempted new immigrants from paying Israeli taxes on income earned abroad for 10 years after arrival. On paper, it was designed to attract Jewish diaspora professionals back to Israel. In practice, it became something else. Israeli banking secrecy already ranked the third most opaque of all OECD member countries, behind only Switzerland and Austria. Combined with this new exemption to make Israel unusually attractive to wealthy individuals looking to restructure their tax exposure. The law drew in billionaires, financiers, and businessmen from Russia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Critics called it openly. One Tel Aviv newspaper ran the headline, "Did a little-noticed tax exemption law turn Israel into a criminal's paradise?" The government never repealed it, and that was before the Bank Hapoalim scandal broke. Bank Hapoalim, Israel's largest bank, the institution at the center of the country's financial system, in 2020 pleaded guilty to conspiring with American taxpayers to hide more than $7.6 billion in more than 5,500 secret Swiss and Israeli bank accounts. The fine, $874 million. It was the second largest Department of Justice offshore tax evasion settlement in history at the time. And it was not the first time an Israeli bank had done this. Bank Leumi had pleaded guilty to the same conduct in 2014. Mizrahi Tefahot Bank in 2019. 3 of Israel's major banks, in sequence, admitted to running secret offshore account networks for wealthy Americans trying to evade the IRS. The total penalties across all 3 exceeded $1.5 billion. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are Department of Justice press releases. In December 2025, Israel's cabinet approved its 2026 budget. The defense allocation, $34 billion. This is not a wartime emergency budget. This is the permanent new baseline. Even after ceasefire agreements, even with the acute phase of conflict reduced, the government locked in a defense spending level that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The finance minister and defense establishment essentially made a joint declaration: this is what Israel costs now. This is the new normal. The sovereign debt implications are significant. Israel's debt-to-GDP ratio, which had been declining for years as the tech economy boomed and tax revenues grew, reversed course sharply. Higher debt means higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs mean more of every future budget goes to interest payments rather than investment. It is a slow compression, not a sudden collapse. But it is real, and it compounds. There is also the question of talent. Israel's high-tech economy runs on a specific type of human capital: young, highly educated, internationally mobile engineers and entrepreneurs. That demographic has options. They can work in Tel Aviv, or they can work in Austin, in London, in Zurich. Extended military service, reserve call-ups, and the general weight of living in a country at sustained high alert creates emigration pressure that GDP data does not capture cleanly. Some are leaving. How many and for how long is a question that will define Israel's economic trajectory more than any budget line. And then there are the global ripple effects, because no economy operates in isolation. When conflict escalated in the Middle East in early 2026 and threatened the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, energy markets reacted instantly. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel. European natural gas prices surged nearly 30% in a single week. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, halted shipments. European households, already stressed by years of energy inflation following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, faced another price shock. The cost of one region's security crisis was being distributed across the utility bills of families in Germany, France, and Spain, who had no direct involvement in any of it. This is the hidden arithmetic of modern geopolitics. When a country spends $112 billion on its own security, the invoice does not stay within its borders. It travels through oil futures and gas spot markets and shipping insurance rates and inflation statistics until it arrives, invisibly, at every economy connected to the global energy system, which is all of them. So what does this story actually tell us? It tells us that Israel built one of the most unusual economic models in modern history. One where the line between military spending and economic growth was deliberately blurred over 75 years until the two became almost impossible to separate. The same culture that produced Iron Dome produced CyberArk and Mobileye and Waze. The same engineers who designed missile guidance systems founded the startups that Google and Intel acquired for billions. Defense and innovation became the same organism. It tells us that war economy logic, in the short term, can genuinely produce growth. Government contracts replace private investment. Defense exports replace civilian exports. The GDP meter keeps moving. But GDP is a measure of activity, not health. A country can have rising output and deteriorating fundamentals simultaneously, and the gap between those two things is where the real risk lives. And it tells us something about the price of security that rarely appears in any official accounting. $112 billion. That is the number on the ledger. But the actual cost, in debt trajectory, in talent retained or lost, in the permanent reconfiguration of a national budget toward defense, in the credit downgrades that will raise borrowing costs for a generation, in the tax laws written quietly in peacetime that reshaped who lives there and why. That number is still being written. The bill, as it turns out, is never really final. It just gets handed to the next generation.